Okay.
My name is Jim Schwentker. I'm 84 years old, and I retired about 4 years ago. When I say retired, that was sort of a gradual thing, I think. I was in this court building on the 4th floor and found that I was putting in more than I was taking out from the monetary standpoint. My secretary was Wilma R. Beal, who had been my secretary since April of 1955. You remember Wilma.
I do.
And she still helps me from time to time. And I graduated from law school. Actually, my law school career began at Columbia University in New York in September of 1949. And I was there and until the next year. What happened, I was a reserve Army officer from World War II, and I got recalled when the Korean War started, which was in June 1950. And I was at Columbia then, but I came on home for the summer and took a chance. I went on back for the fall semester of 1950. And sure enough, I did get called, but I was able to remain there at Columbia long enough in the 3rd semester that I got full credit for it, because there were a lot of veterans who were having to go back then who were in the reserve. And my classmates held a going away party, and so off I went. And fortunately, I was sent to Camp Atterbury, which is located between Indianapolis and Columbus, Indiana, on the highway. And so one of the first things I did on arriving at Camp Atterbury was to drive into Indianapolis to talk to the dean of the IU School of Law at Indianapolis, and that was mainly, at that time, they had a night program. A lot of people who worked during the day wanted to get their legal education at night, and he agreed that I could come in, and so thereafter, about 3 nights a week, I would drive into Indianapolis to continue my law school studies, and that worked pretty well. And finally, however, I was about to get orders to go to Korea. In fact, I may have gotten some orders. I don't remember for sure, but in order for me to get credit for that 3rd semester, I need to finish so much more. And so I called the office of my friend and Congressman Winfield K. Denton, and he got me enough of an extension of time that by taking some oral exams, I got full credit for that 3rd semester. And went on to, but I didn't go to Korea. In the meantime, my father had died in 1951, I guess. And so I was able to finish that. And by that time, however, the war in Korea was winding down, and I didn't have to go. And I was then able to go over to Bloomington, driving over there for a month or so from Camp Atterbury, and then as soon as I got out completely, I got a room in a boarding house in Bloomington and finished my law education at the Indiana University School of Law in Bloomington, and graduated, I think, sometime in late 1952. At least that's when we went to Indianapolis to be sworn in as a lawyer, and also would get sworn in, before the Indiana Supreme Court, and then we went over to the federal court, got entered, raised our right hand there. And I came back to Evansville, and I came back and entered the law school at Indiana and finished. And then I may have some repetition there. I then was ready to start practicing law, and so it happened that I was a friend of Marjorie Waller, who his father was Richard Waller, and he interviewed me and hired me. At that time, in 1952, there was a firm, Waller, McGinnis, and Merrill. Richard McGinnis was an older lawyer, but not as old as Mr. Waller. Mr. Waller was born in 1891, and he had been active even in the war effort in World War II, and maybe even in World War I. But he was a real gentleman, and I was fortunate to become associated with that firm. Now, at that time, he was in the process of that firm. His firm was Waller, McGinnis, and Merrill, and Bailey Merrill had just been elected to Congress in the Eisenhower election that year, and so he was going to Congress. And I got his desk and room that he had on the 10th floor of the Citizens National Bank building, which was at 4th and Main. And it has had several names since then. But that was a building 10 stories high in which they had 2 elevators, each operated by a woman downstairs, and we would take the elevator up to the 10th floor. And that was my introduction to the practice of law. The salaries weren't very high at that time. I think they were, I can't remember, either a month or a week. It was $75. And John Klaus, who was in the same class, was employed by Jim Lopp at $100 a week. He was the highest paid of all the lawyers in our class who came to Evansville. Bill Powell was one, and there were quite a few. And so I did the usual thing. And but as I say, Bailey Merrill went off to Congress, and Mr. Waller and Mr. McGinnis, terminated their partnership mutually. But Mr. McGinnis stayed around a while. He had purchased some land through the Gray Trust, which had a suite in the 9th floor, I think, of that building. And but Mr. McGinnis stayed on, and he was a man who I would listen to. He would be very angry at times when one of his clients got sued. He hated for his client to get sued. He took it as a personal affront. He would swear, but he would run off about every 2 hours to get a cup of coffee at one of the Woods drugstores on Main Street. And then finally he went on to Mississippi, I think it was. And Mr. Waller and Bob Norton, who'd been an associate in Waller, McGinnis, and Merrill, formed a firm known as Waller and Norton, in which I was an associate lawyer, and I would do the things that associates do, as you were saying, take papers to the courthouse. But I also was given an assignment by Mr. Waller to research the validity of a prenuptial agreement for a person who was from here, but who lived in Florida too. But he had been married before, and this person to whom he was thinking of getting married again was from away from here. But he wanted to know what the validity of a prenuptial agreement would be on somebody like this. He's been married before and probably going to live in Florida, and he wanted to know in which jurisdictions such a prenuptial agreement would be effective. And so that was a good experience to have, to get to do that. And unfortunately for everybody, where Mr. Waller developed a form of Lou Gehrig's disease, I forget, something bilateral, it's where you stiffen up, you can't talk. And Mr. Waller ultimately died after a couple years of that. But before he died, I got to witness his handling of a jury trial in court here in Vanderbilt County on a personal injury. It was a case in which we were representing the defendants for the insurance company, and he made a fine address, closing address to the jury, and the jury found for the defendant, and so that was his last trial. Mr. Waller and Mr. Norton, Bob Norton, then and I formed a Norton and Schwentker firm in the same building, and Bob, I always had a great respect for Bob Norton. He was a modest fella, but he was a true lawyer. I mean, he knew the law. And if I had an example, of course, Mr. Waller was a great example, but Bob Norton was too. And we remained partners for, well, we did hire, our first associate was Jerry Atkinson, who was in this building, and later Jerry left, and our firm, and we had as an associate Ken Haney Jr. for a while, and then Ken left to go with the Old National, with the Citizens Trust Department, and and then Jerry left when Tom Norton came. Tom was Bob's son. He got out of law school in Alabama and came up here and practiced law with us. And we practiced until Bob eventually died, and I, at some point, got sick. I was ill for, I don't know how long, maybe 6 or 8 months. I had some condition they couldn't diagnose. They even thought one time I was getting Alzheimer's. But that's when I started thinking of retirement at that time. With some of the other cases we had that I thought were interesting, we had the distinction of representing the senior madam in Evansville. A senior madam, and she was a good customer of the bank, and so was her husband. And the husband finally died, and but Clarence Fuchs, who was a vice president of Citizens Bank, was assigned to her account, and she wanted to consider making a will, and so he took me down there. And before you went down, when you went in there, before you got to start talking business, you had to drink some of her rot gut whiskey, which was really the cheapest you could imagine. But this woman had accumulated a great deal of money, and we finally got her to make a will, which I drew up and presented to her, and she left her residuary estate in trust with the bank as trustee for the benefit of 2 or 3 wonderful charities, and that's still in effect, that trust, I think. And so the other person I represented was Robert Pott, who had invented a wrench of some kind. It was which he got a patent and made a lot of money from that, because it was a real fine invention that he made. And he and his wife had no children, and we had an arrangement that on her death, and then she died first, on his death, his whole estate went into trust for the benefit of engineering students at universities. Mainly, we're thinking of University of Evansville, or Evansville College then. But as it turned out, we had Notre Dame and Wisconsin and some others sharing the income from this trust. And finally USI came along, and maybe even and later Ivy Tech, but they sort of split it up, and I was there was a 3-man advisory committee or 4 to advise the trustee on what we thought, who we thought should get the money, and I think it's still on. I think all the advisory committee have either died or moved or something for the Robert Pott Trust, but the University of Southern Indiana has named either a building or a whole department as a Robert Pott thing, so he got recognition from that. Bob did. Some of our cases that we had as a lawyer, too, was a case of involving a woman who lived down on Southeast First or one of those places, but she had a rooming house. But I don't know if I don't think we represented her in her making a will, but we represented some cousins of hers, and who took care of her, although they lived in Kentucky, but they really cared for her. But this woman left a brother who was, let's put it mildly, he wasn't the most, he didn't like to work or anything else, and he but when she got real sick, he really was close by her. And she died, and these relatives of hers came to us, Bob Nart and me, to represent them and to see if we couldn't. Because, I mean, in the meanwhile, the brother had her change her will to make him the sole beneficiary. And before, he was just one of the several beneficiaries. And the question was this new will valid? And she was old and she did strange things. And this was a jury case. And we got to the end, and we were trying to tell the jury this guy wasn't great or anything, and this woman didn't have the mental capacity to make a new will at that time because she was maybe of unsound mind, and that's one of the grounds. And so we got to the trial, and we made a pretty good case until one of the ladies in her rooming house who'd been there for years, Olima Moat, you remember, she was the drama teacher at Central High School. Very dramatic, too. She was one of her, and I guess the other side put her on the stand, but we got to examine her, and I said, Ms. Moat, don't you think it's possible that this lady who owns the house at that time really was not of completely sound mind at the time? And because she'd been around and seen her and talked with her. And Olima Moat said, eccentric, yes, of unsound mind, no. And we were dead. And we had another case. I forget how we got this case, but it involved a couple who I think lived in Evansville most of the time, but they were with a circus. And the man, the husband, was sort of, he strung along, but his wife would blow a whistle when she wanted him to come. And they put Happy Kellums on the other side, put him on the chair to be a witness. And Happy was a clown. He was well known, Happy Kellum. And he killed his two. He said she blew this whistle for him, and it was anyway, we lost that case too.
Was the clown in makeup? Was Happy Kellums in makeup?
I don't know if he was then or not, but there was a picture of him in the barber shop down here on 5th or 6th Street.
Really?
In the Executive Inn. I think there was something, a picture of Happy Kellums. Now something about, I mentioned Mr. Waller, he a true gentleman. In fact, John Early used to say of Mr. Waller, he said, Dick Waller is too good to be true. And he was a great man, and it was so sad that he had to die. And that was an antagonist. I mean, that was bad, that disease. But he'd born in Kentucky, and he'd come up here. I think he graduated from the Yale Law School, and maybe was active in the World War I. He was born in 1891. And his other daughter, I mentioned his younger one was Marjorie Waller Smith, was Dorothy Waller Stone, married to Jack Stone, who's a lawyer, still practicing until about 4 or 5 months ago.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't need to, but did. And Dottie's had to more or less take care of him because he's not in too good a shape. But they were a fine family, and I was happy to have been associated with Richard Waller. I can think of other stories and cases, but I think right now it's about all I can think of. Can you think of anything?
Well, I want to ask you, Jim, if you could hear an oral history from someone, if you could hear their story, who would it be? Who do you think was somebody that you'd like to sit down and hear what they had to say that you knew about?
As a lawyer?
As a lawyer.
Well, most are dead.
Well, I know. So, but I mean, if there were ones that that you knew as a young man that you thought were particularly interesting. A lot of people have said, when you ask that question, have said John Klaus.
Well, I would say John Sanders.
John, that's interesting.
I would say John Sanders. His office was on the first floor of this building.
Yes.
At the end, and neither he or Florence, wasn't that his secretary?
Mm-hmm.
Neither one could hear very well.
That's true.
And for a long time, she was keeping the minutes for the Bar Association. Way back, I think. She was doing some work before we had a regular office. I could be wrong on that, but I remember one time John Sanders, who was a very kind man, and his first wife was Edna, who was also a lawyer, and she would teach as a substitute teacher at Bosse High School, where I went, and at the time I went. She was a very bright woman, and John and she would go around to auctions on Saturday and buy furniture and works of art and such. And but one time I said to John, and he was getting up in years, and I noticed that on his old beat-up Mercedes-Benz automobile, he had a Warwick County license. So I said, "Now, John, do you have property up there?" He said, "I have a farm." And I said, "Well, do you raise crops?" He said, "Yes, some crops, but I also have horses." I said, "Horses?" And he said, "And I ride them too." You ride them, and he had to be 80 then. He said, "And I jump them too." I knew he was pulling my leg. He had to. But there was a sense of humor for this guy, and of course we know his second wife, and he ended up giving practically their whole fortune to, I think David Keck handled that estate.
For history's sake, David Keck handled
maybe hers.
John, and Sheila Corcoran handled Evelyn when she...
Is that what it was? I
Yes.
wasn't sure.
Well, David had died.
Oh, David had died then, yeah.
In between.
Okay.
And so I know that Sheila handled Evelyn's when she gave the remainder to 30 different charities.
But she gave the residue to the bar, wasn't it? The Bar Foundation?
Her initial gift was to the Bar Foundation.
Well, that was
for $1 million, yes.
$1 million.
And then the remainder of the estate went to 30 different charities.
Uh-huh.
substantial gifts to
Oh,
30
yeah.
different charities.
Well, that was wonderful.
They had quite an impact on the community.
Well, this was really John's money that he had
Yes,
accumulated.
she had no idea.
No. He,
He was a beekeeper, you know. He liked to, he did honey.
oh, he did, yeah.
That was-
On this farm?
Hmm.
Yeah. That was very interesting. But I always admired him. He was a caring person. He really was. But in a case, I had some cases with him where he represented defendants who owed money to different clients of mine. And he did a real good job in defending them and getting them a settlement. And, but that was interesting.
He was an interesting man.
Yeah.
We asked him to do an oral history 20 years ago,
Uh-huh.
and he wouldn't do it. He said, I'll talk about the future, but I don't want to talk about the past.
No, well, I can
And that
understand.
was his attitude.
Yeah.
But he had special things going for him, for
Yeah.
himself.
Yeah.
Tell Bob Norton, talk just a little bit about him. He was one of the folks that I think everyone really admired
Yeah.
also.
Bob Norton was born and raised in, I think, Minnesota, right on the river between Wisconsin and Minnesota. And a teacher of his in high school in this town of Minnesota, let's say, a young man who was either he was a graduate of or had great respect for Wabash College in Indiana, and he had sent several people from his school there to Wabash. And Bob Norton went to Wabash, had 3 jobs at one time to pay his expenses. Then World War II came along, and Bob got to be a captain. He was in charge of a tank, one of these tanks in the Marine. He was a Marine Corps person, and war ended, and I don't know if that's whether he'd already been to Wabash or not, but in any event, after Wabash, he went to Indiana University School of Law at Bloomington, where he was an honor student and very modest. Somebody would say, I had a good memory too. I heard George Barnett say one time, we were talking about Bob Norton, could remember the questions, you know, for a long time, and could remember what the answer was. But George Barnett said, I'd remember what seat he was in, but I never could remember George was modest. That was, we've had some real characters. I mean, if you had to write about somebody, you'd probably write about Klaus first.
Klaus, George Barnett, Marion Rice,
even John Bunner when he'd had a few drinks.
You know, I have to tell you that John Bunner, when the first week I had this job,
Yeah.
the absolute first week, I got a call from 60 Minutes looking for John Bunner to interview him about a case
Yeah.
that he had done that had was precedent.
He
setting
did a
law.
wonderful job as public defender.
Mhm.
John Bunner was a wonderful. Somebody said at one point that Marion Rice had challenged him or something to a little fight, and John knocked Marion down. I don't know if they both had some drinks, but
Apparently I had heard that there had been a fight between the two.
yeah.
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 He,
But getting back to David Keck, there was really a fine man, and who got multiple sclerosis. He had some debilitating
yes,
disease.
it was either MS or Lou Gehrig's
MS or Lou Gehrig's or
disease
something.
or something like that. Yeah.
But he,
Took him very quickly.
yeah, and he was okay. He could think fine, but he couldn't talk.
Couldn't talk.
He would try to tell you, ask you a question, but he just couldn't get it out. And it was a blessing that he finally died, because he wasn't going to get over that. I used to visit him at the Evansville Protestant home where he ended up, and he just a fine, fine fella.
What do you see as the major difference between when you started the practice and now? Is it the collegiality? Is it?
I mean, there's less.
Yes.
I mean, they're so large. Well, of course, we had no women. Ruth Mayer, even in the composite photo of bar members in 1961 or 62, only had Ruth. Then in the composite in 68, there was one other lady. I can't remember her name.
Jane Walden, I think.
Jane Walden. And there were still, in 62, Mr. Waller, I know, had died, but there were still Henry Walker Sr. and Henry Walker Jr. Were there. And then Joanne, when they were clearing out my office, brought home it wasn't framed, but all these rolled up. Took two to have all the members, and I can't remember if that was 97 or some such time, wasn't it?
Yes.
And showed quite a few women then. And there were quite a few more lawyers. Way back there were barely 100. When I came there, I bet there were barely 100 lawyers in town. And there was this story, it may have been apocryphal, that this one older lawyer was sick in the hospital, and Fred Bamberger went to visit him. And the guy somehow said he had some reason to have his gun. So he asked Fred to get the gun, that Fred did. The story is, and the guy shot himself. Yeah, that was it. Quite a bit. This could be apocryphal, but that was the story that Fred was doing.
Amazing.
But now, if you wanted to talk about good lawyers, there wasn't a better trial lawyer than Fred Bamberger in a defense capacity. And of course, John Jennings was the super plaintiff's lawyer, and he and Fred would get into some rather bitter battles in court in front of a jury, and it was always interesting to watch that.
And have drinks then after the court? Have a drink together after court?
Might have, yeah. I'll tell you a funny story about Jack Kane. Jack had a big practice because he was just very personable. Everybody loved Jack, and he had this big practice, and he represented a man who had been charged with either drunken driving or wasn't a major thing. And the thing was set for hearing, and it may have been in the old, down at 3rd and Main, in the old city hall where they had the court, city court. And they called this fellow up, and Jack hadn't arrived to represent him. The guy had nothing to do but go up there because they called the case. And apparently he got fined something, but he was furious. And he was leaving, and here came Jack. And this guy could have killed him. And Jack said, well, what did he give you? And the guy said, maybe 25 in costs or something. And Jack said, I told you I'd take care of it. Now that's landing on your 2 feet.
That's good. That is good. Well, if you had one thing to say to a lawyer coming in today, what would you tell him? Jim, do you have a piece of advice to a young lawyer or somebody that's getting ready to enter the profession?
When I was in New York at Columbia, I read the New York Times one day, and somebody asked Albert Einstein what he would advise a young man to do. He said, I'd advise him to be a plumber. Now, whether that would hold good to lawyers, I don't know. I think they're getting to be maybe too many. I don't know. I know there's a great shortage of family medical doctors.
It's a great shortage of good plumbers, too.
Yeah,
Think
right.
about it.
Yeah, and electricians.
There always will be.
Yeah. But
very good. Anything you want to close with?
Well,
Have you had a good time?
I've had a good time, and I wish the Bar Association the very best, and I'll remain as a retired and member status. And at night I wake up, I have dreams about practicing law, you know. And
Are you sorry you aren't still practicing?
sometime,
Are you?
but I have, fortunately, I don't need to earn the money. I mean, I was fortunately able to, with good luck and whatnot, I was able to reach a point where my income exceeds that which I ever had as a lawyer, because we weren't a Gary Gerling firm, or even certainly Condees, Donovan and Kahn and these other places who do very well. But I did notice that when I started practicing law, the secretary was typing on a regular typewriter and had carbon paper for copies. And we got one of the first machines. It was called a thermofax machine. We had a little folder, and you knew what those were. And we bought the second one in town. A Faultless Caster had the first one, and they were ordered another one, but I knew the Noltings, and they let us have this one, that old thermofax. Things just went up on better, you know, IBM electric typewriters and all these copy machines, and then the computer, of course.
Whole different world now.
Yeah.
And John Sanders closed his office. They were still using Remington's electric typewriters with the little ball on it. They never did get computers with John Sanders. Died at 100, never gave in.
Didn't need them.
Thank you.
Well, you're welcome.
Very much,
You're welcome.
Jim. Appreciate it.
I wish I